Welcome. This is Science Bro. This is a channel that brings you the latest information on living soil cannabis. Well, really cannabis of all type, but obviously our specialty is living soil cannabis. This is the first video in a series called Surviving Regulated Cannabis, where I'm going to cover the aspects needed to get under control for a regulated facility in order to have success. Now, if you're not a regulated cannabis facility, all these same rules still apply to you, so have no fear. But especially if you're paying high taxes, high costs, labor, all that stuff, you should probably get these types of things in order. And so I wanted to start out with probably the first most important aspect that everyone should start out with, which is your water test. And if you happen to be listening live, go ahead and drop your comments and questions in the chat, and we'll circle back around at the end of the presentation and go over some of those questions. If you're watching this at a later date, go ahead and put your comments in the comment section, and I'll circle back around and we'll get those questions answered for you. All right, so undeniably, in my humble opinion, the first place that you should start when you're engaging in the farming activity is looking at your water. Undeniably, the water is the largest input by volume, by frequency. Undeniably, the largest contribution to your agricultural process is likely going to be your water. Having said that, very few farms that we take on in our professional consulting have already been doing water analysis before we started that relationship. So that's one of the first things that we get going when we start with either a new masterclass student or a client or anything along those lines. If you don't know what is going on with your water, you're likely going to be battling issues or oftentimes creating issues for yourselves due to aspects of that water that you're unaware of. So what I want to do is kind of go over some of the basic parameters and give you some, at least a place to start, right? So the first thing we should look at is a water test. Right here I've got one from Logan Labs. I really like Logan Labs. They're great for the soil testing, and they also do a really affordable water test. The only problem with the Logan Lab water test is, in my personal opinion, if you are farming in a regulated cannabis situation, you need more data than what the most comprehensive Logan Lab water test provides for you. There's been several situations in our professional consulting career where a water test similar to the Logan test that doesn't have all the elements on it has led to problems because of issues that weren't measured. So the good aspect of this test is it's affordable, and generally speaking, for the agricultural process, it gives you roughly all the information that you need in order to make an educated decision. But as you'll see, it doesn't have all of the trace minerals. So, starting off very basic, sample IDs, all that stuff. With the water, it can't get too out of whack. Usually you have one source, but as with all data, it's important to start with a sensible title for that data set and try to maintain it as the same name as you go along. So don't keep changing the name of your water source, and just stick to one consistent name. If you are farming at multiple locations, you are going to want to clearly define that location, which does happen. But usually people are dealing with one single property. So the good parts of this test is it covers, very obvious pH, water quality parameters, so the hardness. The conductivity is, generally the quantity of mineral in that water. And so the more mineral that's in that water, the higher the conductivity, but also the higher the sodium is going to be increasing conductivity. So higher isn't necessarily better. Sodium absorption ratio is basically a concept of how absorbable is the sodium in that water going to be, and it's a ratio between the other elements that are in that water that determines that sodium absorption ratio. So it's not a linear data point, but that's something you definitely want to look at. Obviously, the lower the better. Most waters are below 1, but when you start to get above 2, above 3, you're going to have to take very direct action to deal with the sodium absorption ratio in that water, and likely that SARs coming from high sodium. So once you start to get into 2 and 3 and above 3, I've seen a few above 4, there's significant issues with sodium. So you're going to want to address that. It does cover the basic cations, so calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, and it's got iron here. I'm not sure why iron is also up here with the other major cations. The only other trace mineral on this test is boron. So that's great, I think, for your just average farmer, but in the case of regulated cannabis, the stakes are much, much higher than the typical farming situation. And so my personal belief, you need to know calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, but you also need to know all the trace minerals. You need to know iron, manganese, copper, and zinc, and boron. So there's been a few situations in our professional consulting where manganese was in toxic levels in that source water, and it wasn't picked up on this test. And we spent weeks trying to determine what the actual cause of those plant health problems were. When we got a more comprehensive water test, we found out there was actually toxic levels of manganese. I've also seen pretty significant problematic levels of copper and zinc in certain waters. Sometimes I think that comes from the plumbing and old pipe fittings and things like that. So another thing that I look at here is bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is a byproduct of the weathering of rocks in the aquifer. And so that's going to be built up higher, typically, in well water sources, but you also do see it in various city waters. But basically, the higher the bicarbonate is, the harder it is to get minerals into the plant. So the bicarbonate kind of ties up complexes, get in the way of, I'm not sure the exact specificity from a chemistry standpoint, but I can tell you that when bicarbonate starts to get above 200, we start to see significant problems getting minerals into the plant, which is the entire goal. You really want to build your fertility in that water so that it can get into the plant. That's a main goal. Bicarbonate is one of those items that gets in the way. So you're going to want to watch that. There's not a lot you can do with bicarbonate except try to treat for it or complex it. And we use Provita, which is a product that we sell on our website that contains all the organic acids and some other beneficial compounds in there. And it does the best job of actually reducing bicarbonate on the soil test, or on the water test rather, and then it also accelerates nutrient uptake. So if you're in a situation where bicarbonates are an actual issue, at minimum, you need to be combining something that's going to complex or deal with that bicarbonate when you're building your fertilization strategy. So you can get by in a thriving living soil system having high levels of bicarbonate in just your water, so that you water the plants with. But as soon as you start to build fertilization in that water, you really need to deal with the bicarbonate. One of the other major issues that we see is chloride. So chloride is readily taken up into the cannabis plant, and it often becomes a problem. So chloride in and of itself can induce bug problems. So oftentimes we see, we are currently in the spray IPM products all week long era, which is kind of a new era that I don't subscribe to. But if you're one of those people that sprays pest or mold control products prophylactically throughout the week, and you're also one of those people that has chloride that's higher than, let's say 50 to 75 parts per million, if you just took water with 100 parts per million of chloride in it and spray it on your plant, you're going to manufacture a bug problem. So one of the biggest issues we see on farms that are really battling pest problems, they can't figure it out. We do a preliminary water test and boom, what do you see? 150, 200 parts per million of chloride. You see that a lot in Oklahoma. I'm not sure what they did in Oklahoma, but a lot of those underground water systems are pretty destroyed from old eras of agriculture. I don't know if it's like dairy manures or really what it is, but I've seen some pretty significant levels of chloride. You also see that near the ocean, obviously. So sometimes the underground water sources get seawater infiltration into them, and you get high chloride. So that's something that absolutely needs to be addressed. Also here on the Logan, you've got sulfate, which is just good to know, and then salt concentration. You need to know the levels of salt in your water. One of the biggest issues with living soil is when things like sodium and salt starts to build up in the soil, because there's not a lot you can do with it. In case of cannabis in general, when we are doing multiple crop cycles in a calendar year, we are radically accelerating anything that we do that's problematic. So, so we want to know if we are contributing regularly high levels of things like chloride, bicarbonate, and salt. So on this Logan test, we've also got boron, which is good to know, but it's only part of the story. And then it is nice, they do a little cation-anion ratio, which is important when you start to get really into high-performance fertilization. So in my most preferred scenario, I would actually use Wallace Labs in Los Angeles. They are a fantastic lab. They've been very accurate, and we've seen significant benefit from incorporating their water tests. So I really like Logan for soil tests. I really like Wallace for water. I do not like Wallace for soil tests, but I do like them for water. So we'll kind of pick and choose between the labs of what provides the actual greatest benefit to the farmer. Undeniably, the best water test I've seen here comes from Wallace Labs. Now, this test is $95, where the Logan test is $45. But if you look at cost per element, this is actually a significantly better deal, because you get like, I don't know, was it 32 elements here? 1, 2, 3, 4. 29. You get 29 different elements here. And the important part is all of the trace minerals are covered. The trace minerals are covered, at least the major ones: iron, manganese, copper, zinc, boron, cobalt, molybdenum, selenium. In the case of the newest era of high-performance lighting, there's a 0% chance you're going to get those higher intensity LEDs turned up all the way if you don't have cobalt and molybdenum sorted out. And so those need to be in the fertilization in certain quantities, or you're just constantly going to have issues using the full capacity of those lights. So we've got all the major elements here: phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium. We also got sodium. Now, here's the big thing. If you're talking about regulated cannabis, most cities, states, counties, countries are now including heavy metal testing. A lot of them are following the very strict standards that were set forth in California. So here we've got constant checking in on our contribution of the 4 or 5 heavy metals that are tested for in the regulated space. So you're talking about California, Oklahoma is arsenic, cadmium, mercury, and lead. Michigan added nickel. And you're seeing those same 4 or 5 heavy metals that are being measured in now any city, state, county, country that comes online. Heavy metals is a big deal. So significantly more information per the dollar. A lot of these things, I'll be honest, I'm not sure what the targets for strontium or titanium are, but I can definitely tell you we use every one of these trace minerals in our data set. So same kind of thing here is we've got pH, conductivity, we've got bicarbonate as well. Here we've got the nitrogen separated into nitrate and ammonium. If you really want to start to embark into high performance production, regardless of the crop, you need to know the ratio between nitrate and ammoniacal nitrogen in your fertilization. So typically that nitrate is used for the vegetative green biomass production of your plant, and then this ammonium or ammoniacal nitrogen is going to be for the fruit, flower, seed reproductive stages. So typically nitrate is used more early on. The ammonium form is used typically more later on. And one really proper way to constantly battle powdery mildew is to fertilize aggressively with nitrate, nitrogen. You could have everything else dialed in. You could have the perfect environment. You could have very resilient genetics. But if you're pushing nitrates with your fertilization, you're going to literally manufacture powdery mildew pressure. I had a call today with a buddy that does a lot of hydroponics consulting, and he was talking about the issues of pistil formation and delaying of maturation on the cannabis plant with high levels of nitrogen later on, which is not something we really run into in living soil. It's pretty easy to do in hydroponics. And so we've also got our chloride, which is really important, our sodium absorption ratio, and then the adjusted sodium absorption ratio, which is actually, the adjusted sodium absorption ratio is the one that we actually look for because it's taking into consideration other quality aspects of that water. Over here in the right-hand column of this Wallace test, they give you some basic parameters. This is like a really agricultural-minded, it's not really cannabis-focused. It's not wrong per se, but it's some basic guidelines. So they're saying we want to minimize our sodium in the foliar applications to below 70. I would still think that's pretty high. But when you look at the average well water, there's typically 30, 40, 50, 70, sometimes 300 parts per million of sodium. And so we definitely want to at least be mindful of what we're giving to our plant on a literal daily basis, right? So there's some targets here. What's interesting here is, so like they've got some for lead, so 5 parts per million for lead. If you're watering your cannabis plant with water that has 5 parts per million of lead, you're probably going to fail for lead. So you always got to be careful with agricultural recommendations. A lot of times it doesn't really apply for regulated cannabis. Here we've got something that's really interesting. When I first started using Wallace almost 10 years ago, it used to say 50 for foliar, and this is 70. This is for root applied, 75 for root applied. I'm not sure what changed in their process, but I noticed this changed about 2-3 years ago. I definitely do not subscribe to that, and I still kind of go by some old parameters, whereas like in hydroponics, if you start to get above 50, 60, 70 to the root zone, you're going to manufacture a pest problem. Same with the foliar applied. If you're up into the 50s, 60s, like 100, with cannabis, you will manufacture a pest problem if you are foliar feeding with chloride that is 100 parts per million. So, we got for the sake of cannabis, we need to determine our own targets. This here is some general recommendations. This is more of like a flood irrigation, large agricultural concept, and basically how they look at it is, gypsum, solution grade gypsum, is something that's quite easy to inject into the irrigation to add to your flood irrigation. And so gypsum, I guess with the sulfur, can help with sodium. It can help with bicarbonate and magnesium, and so they'll give recommendations there. I don't usually find that is too helpful for cannabis considerations, but undeniably this is the best bang for the buck, best results, and it continues to prove to be very accurate. Now, how do we use these things? Well, at minimum, in my opinion, before you start this process, you should be doing a water test. That's the first thing that you should do. Now, we have a lot of conversations in the regulated space with regards to building out facilities. And so we primarily have most of our conversations with farms after the facility's built, after they've been operational for a while, and some problems manifest. That's just usually the supply, the funnel to my business is usually after things have gone really bad. And we're pretty good at turning things around when things have been pretty bad. But in the situations where we're at the front end of facility development and design, which I only do a couple of those a year, and we're really selective when we do that. But my advice to anybody that is considering purchasing a farm, what I say is before you even ask the price of the farm or any of the terms, go get a water test. Because if the water's crappy, it doesn't matter if that farm is free. it's going to be a nightmare to farm with crappy water. And you want to know this way at the front end. So first thing that we need to do, in my opinion, is start with a water test. Look at what you're up against or what your advantages are. There's some very good quality water in certain places. There's some water that's darn right not even fit for plant growth. So you want to know that before you spend a single dollar on infrastructure, if at all possible. Now, that's very few farmers on the planet have started with a water test. And like I said earlier, I can't even think of the last farmer that we took on as a client that already had a water test. So that's usually the first thing that we do before we even have many other conversations. And you need to start there. Now, how often do you do that water test? Well, that determines on your water source. So one that always pops into mind is Denver, Colorado. Denver, Colorado has one of the most radical changes in water supply throughout the year, and they actually notify residents. And I can't remember the exact date that it changes, but it goes from being like a perfect 6.4 pH to like an 8.5. It's been a long time since I read one of those notes, but I think it has something to do with when the water source changes and it's moving from an older section of town that maybe has lead pipes or old plumbing and fittings. Oftentimes they'll actually modify the pH in order to not make the heavy metals and toxins soluble. So I think in that situation, they're actually adjusting the pH. Now, in other situations, like in Southern Oregon, is another place I've seen extremely radical water supply changes throughout the year. And it's one particular farm would, for half the year, have toxic levels of manganese, and through half the year have toxic levels of boron. So both of those are problems that are not resolved with traditional RO systems, and you actually need an RO system with a supplemental trace mineral filter. So you want to first identify what it is you're dealing with, and then there's going to be maintenance. So if your city, if you happen to farm in Denver, Colorado, and they mail you a letter and says, hey, on June 1st, we're going to change our water supply and it's going to change in pH, that's super handy. I don't find that most cities and counties actually warn their water customers. A lot of them are aware when their water source changes. So you can start out by calling your water provider and find out, hey, is my water source the same all throughout the year, or do you change it from one reservoir to another? Try to find out when that general seasonal change will be is the easiest way to do it. And then you're going to want to change at that seasonal change. So common problem we see in most farms, especially in the organic world where most people are not using reverse osmosis, if that water source changes and the mineral content changes, you better sure change your fertilization strategy because it now no longer matches. So if you have navigated, whether through experience and practical application or through testing, a good desirable fertilization balance that works with your water, when that water source changes, all those ratios are going to get thrown out of whack. So the easiest way to handle this is if you're a cannabis farmer that's having 4 harvests in a calendar year or 2 or 3 greenhouse crops, testing at the start of each one of those cycles for 1 year is likely going to give you really strong indication of how consistent your water is throughout the year and if it changes or not. And exactly when it changes, you'll be able to narrow it down. Another easy way to do that is, which isn't foolproof, but in the case of Denver, where it goes from 6.3 to 8.4, even a handheld pH meter will tell you when that change happens. So, in the organic world, there's a lot of dismissing of meters and measurements and testing, and I don't know, man. I'm never going to get on board with that. You need to take appropriate assessment of your process, and an easy way to do that is if every week or so you measure the pH and parts per million of your water, give you a pretty good indication when it changes. So if you're starting out a new year, starting out a new farm, starting out a new process, you can start by just measuring the pH of your water each week and see if it changed at all. If it doesn't change at all, there's a good chance that your water source stays consistent throughout the year. You still need to analyze it, right? So we're going to check initially, and we're going to periodically test to try and determine if our water sources changes. Is to me, that's minimum farming needs. Now, starts to have the conversation of what do we do with filtration. This is the number one question I get asked. Farmers that are coming from other areas of cultivation like hydroponics, they seem just that reverse osmosis is the answer. But in the case of living soil, reverse osmosis would be kind of my last choice, only when I have to type of thing. But when I have to, then you need to. And again, if I had the choice, I would purchase a farm that doesn't require reverse osmosis treatment in order to farm, because that's going to be difficult moving into a changing environment. And if water sources become scarce, you don't want to be wasting 6 to 1 in order to farm. That's going to be tough. So, but if you are in a situation where you need to use reverse osmosis water, you also need to do a water test of that reverse osmosis water to know when you need to change or service your water system. So most people buy RO system and just start using it and have no clue that 6 months down the line, maybe one of the membrane ruptured and it's letting 100 parts per million through because nobody really measures these things. And so you need to, or it's my advice, you can do whatever you want, but my advice would be to start with basic handheld pH ppm readings to get a general idea of what comes out the end of my filtration when the system is brand new. If my water, if my reverse osmosis treatment system produces 12 ppm water and 6 months later it's producing 90 ppm water, well, there's clearly a problem there. And you need to identify what those parts per million are made of so that you can modify and adjust your strategy for fertilization. So that's dealing with RO. Now, the reason why RO is not desirable in my viewpoint is one of the limitations to living soil and organics. Now, again, it can't all be perfect. Like, it can't be all advantages over other techniques. There have to be some disadvantages. It's just the way it works. There's significantly more advantages than disadvantages, but one of the disadvantages of living soil and the principles of water with regards to organic fertilizers is in hydroponics, you can use pH up and pH down correction chemicals, and that's perfectly fine and standard. In living soil systems, those traditional pH correction products are some of the most antimicrobial products you can use. And if you're constantly adjusting your water with those chemical products, you're going to create a problem that is significantly worse than having water that needs to be adjusted for pH. So we want to try and limit at every step possible adding compounds to our water that are antimicrobial. So that's the first thing. Now, when you talk about organic strategies for increasing pH, in my mind, there are none. There are some hydrogen-based products, but you want to drive yourself mad, try to correct pH with a hydrogen-based pH up product. That shit just flat out sucks. I've tried it on a couple farms, and it's enough to make you want to pull your hair out. It takes hours for it to truly stabilize. The instructions start to figure out how much you need to add to the water and then do it the night before. And it's like, nobody's got time for that. That's not even realistic. And it's at least problematic. So you have to remove from your mind that increasing pH of a solution is just not possible in my viewpoint. So that only leaves us the option to lower pH. And there's limits within that, because what you need to do in order to lower the pH of your waters, you need to use an acid. So fulvic acid is the safest, most beneficial product that you can adjust the pH of in a living soil system. Citric acid is undeniably the worst choice, right? It's really popular on the internet. It's really popular. It started being talked about a few years ago. Keep in mind, the people that are advertising and suggesting you use citric acid to adjust your pH in a living soil system have never done a biological assessment of their process. And by the nature of our work, we've done many biological assessments of these people's clients. It's a bad idea, so don't do it. What's up, Sammy? Thanks for joining in, homie. I'm over here talking to myself on the internet. Shout out to Sammy. So citric acid is not going to be a choice that you want to mess with. And that's really hard for people to wrap their mind around. Do a little bit of biological assessment of your product and you'll see exactly what we're talking about. it's very problematic. So citric acid's off the table. Fulvic acid does work. Phosphoric acid is an acid which would lower your pH, but now you're putting chemicals into a living soil system, probably not going to be the best option. So there's not a lot of options for modifying the pH of the water. And even within fulvic acid, there's a limit, because you can put a certain amount of fulvic acid in that water to moderately reduce pH, but there's a limit to that because you're still dealing with the biological system. So the more fulvic acid you use to adjust pH, the more likely you are to cause a biological issue, which is going to create pest and disease issues. So there's a finite amount of fulvic acid you can use to correct your water. So our only option is lowering pH, and we can only do it a little bit. Now, with the case of reverse osmosis water, as you start to add organic amendments to that, your pH is likely going to go down. And so there's a balance between how much mineral can we put into that water without driving the pH too low. So in hydroponics, we can continue adding fertilizers to that water, raising the concentration of minerals in that water, increasing the EC, increasing the ppms, and if the pH is too low, we can just add up. Well, in organics, you can't do that. So you need to build your fertilization until a point where the pH is acceptable, and part of that acceptable pH is having a desirable balance of minerals in that water. And so there's a limit to how concentrated you can make that solution. So by default, in order to increase fertilization through the harvest cycle, which in hydroponics we do that by increasing the EC of that water and then adjusting for pH, in organics you have to increase the volume of fertilization that you deliver, because you need to build that fertility to where it ends up in a hospitable pH rate. I hope that makes sense, and I hope that's helpful. So with RO, the limitations are you can only build fertility up so high. Now, if you're dealing with well water that has 120 parts per million of calcium and magnesium and trace minerals, well, you can put significantly more fertilizer into that water and build up that solution strength, because that water is more stable and reduces less. So that simple fact is why reverse osmosis is my last choice, and I only do reverse osmosis when we have to remove something very problematic like heavy metals, sodium, bicarbonate, chlorides, things like that. If there's just mineral in that water, leave it. Like, if you're doing reverse osmosis, you're stripping out minerals that you have to pay to put back. And most people talk about using reverse osmosis to treat that water and then remineralizing it. And then it's like, often I've seen many times where we do an analysis of the water before the RO and the analysis of the water after the farmer has RO and then remineralized, and the starting water was way better than what the farmer was doing to remineralize. So we need to pay attention to these things. We need to pay attention to the quantity and balance of calcium and magnesium. So there are desirable ranges and ratios of calcium to magnesium. So, you know, typically in a water solution, you're looking for like a 4-to-1 up to a 6-to-1 calcium to magnesium ratio. If you have very high levels of magnesium in that water and you start to narrow that ratio, so you make that number smaller, so I've seen like 2-to-1, even 1-to-1, that's going to be a problem that you need to address. So you need to know what the composition of that water is, and then you can use different fertilization tools in order to improve that water source. So if you've got 20, 30 parts per million of magnesium in that water, but only 50 parts per million of calcium, well, you need to make that calcium higher. Now, if you add something like calcium boron would be a really good choice. If you add a little bit of calcium boron, that raw water is now fertilization, because now you're using to your advantage the ratios of calcium and magnesium in that water as an actual nutrient. So we need to start thinking about our water differently and not just rushing to stripping the mineral content out of it. So basic principles. Now, just to kind of wrap up the concept of the difference between leaving water as it is, pH and RO, is like most farmers, because they're not analyzing what's in that water, they just want to strip it out and get RO. But really, sometimes just lightly conditioning that water can make it fantastic. So a little bit of fulvic acid. So my preferred product is the Organics Alive FPF, which is made from fermented grain, and then it's stabilized into a liquid with an acid. That stuff is very good at lowering the pH of water and fertilization solutions. But again, there's a limit. You can't really go more than 1 to 2 milliliters per gallon of that product before you start to create a biological issue by putting too much food, because fulvic acid is also food, into the system, right? And a lot of times in my consulting, a farmer will have perfect water from a mineral balance and mineral content standpoint, but because it has a lot of calcium and magnesium, sometimes a little sodium in it, the pH is high and they start to get frantic and they want to lower the pH. And honestly, just leave it alone. Like, in my opinion, the balance of mineral in that water is far more important than just the pH, right? We as cannabis farmers get way too hyper-focused on just pH as the sole data point. And I'm not saying you can ignore it, because usually when the pH is away from what we want it to be, either high or low, usually that's because the minerals are not balanced in that water. But, oftentimes I'll recommend adding something like fertinitrofulvic, which is a powdered version of that fermented grain fulvic extract, just like the Organics Live, but it's in a dry form. So same concept as a product, and it often does not lower the pH at all, even though it's fulvic acid. You would think that the fulvic acid would lower the pH, but there's a lot of times where it actually lightly increases pH and the farmers freak out. But I'm still, every single day of the week, I would take a water with good content of minerals and good balance of minerals that has a slightly higher pH with a little bit of powdered fulvic acid in it. Even if it raises the pH, I still say that's great. And so we really need to, I guess I'm speaking predominantly to a living soil world in this statement, but we need to look at what the mineral content is in there and not focus so much on the pH. Now, if you're talking about hydroponics, obviously, if your pH is out of whack, there's an obvious problem there. But again, I've worked with many hydroponic growers that have mineral balance of their fertilization that's horrible, but because they adjusted the pH to 6.2, they think it's perfect. And so just because you adjusted the pH to 6.2 doesn't mean that that fertilizer balance has any relevance to what you're trying to do, right? So even in a hydroponic environment, we need to be analyzing our water, right? So one of the major difference between the hydroponic world and the organic world is I've worked with literally famous hydroponic growers that do an analysis of their fertilization every single week of the harvest cycle. Spoke to a guy today that does it every 2 weeks. You go to the living soil world, try to find a farmer that's done an analysis one time, right? That's a significant deficit, in my opinion, in the living soil world, and I would highly encourage you to step up your game on water, because a lot of times you're actually manufacturing problems. So what comes to mind is one of our students, Noah. He's fairly close to the ocean, I'd guess, or maybe it's the dairy. Either way, he's got high chloride in the water, and he was really frustrated for a long time. We got that first water test, dealt with that water, and most of those problems just went away. So instead of spending our money on pest control products, determine if you're spraying 200 part per million of chloride on your plant. That's going to manufacture a mite problem, guaranteed, every day of the week. So, we, in our professional consulting, we start with a water test. Every time we change a fertilization recipe, we double check with the same Wallace test and verify that the mineral balance of what we're delivering to our plant is appropriate, because ultimately what it comes down to is specific ratios. So the ratio between calcium and magnesium. If you have proportionately high magnesium, that's going to be a yield and a quality killer. in today's era of cannabis, you cannot afford one aspect of cultivation that reduces quality or reduces yield. You need to address it. In order to build healthy plants in a vegetative stage, you need more calcium than potassium. In order to fill dense, attractive, high-yielding flowers, you need to have more potassium than calcium in that fertilization. And so we're big advocates of the Organics Live powders. I think they're great tools to use within a comprehensive full fertility fertilization strategy. But I did 3 water tests today of 3 different farmers. One had 12 parts per million of calcium, one had 30 parts per million of calcium, and one had 120 parts per million of calcium. If they're all following the same recipe of 1 teaspoon per gallon, we'll say, one of those farmers is going to have good results, 2 of them are going to have bad results. And so we need to pay attention to our process a little bit more, do some water tests. I would strongly advise, if you're mixing up a fertilizer recipe, check that. Every time you buy new products, you should do it again. So we need to find some sort of happy medium. If you look at the most qualified, the most well-respected hydroponic farmers on the world, I bet you $100 when they make up a fertilizer recipe, either once a week or every 2 weeks, they're sending that in for analysis. I promise you, because I've worked with them and I know. And in the living soil world, people barely do a water test. So get on the testing. So looks like we got a question here. I'm going to go ahead and jump on to that, try and keep it short tonight. So it says here, would you advise using just a mineral filter if needed, or does a mineral filter need to be used with RO? So I'm going to have to guess. Feel free to drop in the chat. I'm going to guess what I think you mean there is sometimes there's additional attachments that remineralize the water. So that might be what you're talking about here. In that case, I haven't had a lot of experience and or great success with like a commercially available water treatment solution. And so in years past, we used to try different Coligan water treatments. So if you go to like somebody like Coligan, they have cartridge systems for dealing with high sodium for the homes. A lot of those are exchange bed filters. And so sodium comes through, the sodium gets deposited in the media, and something gets released. I'm not sure what that thing that gets released is, but I can tell you it's very problematic in living soil, and it builds up, and it's very bad. So we had some early struggles early on trying to deal with sodium with like a standard consumer home drinking water solution. Some of the, what do you call those? Oh man, can't think of the word right now. Water ionizers, that's what it's called. Some of the water ionizers have a media attachment that remineralizes for RO, because you can't put RO through those water ionizers like the Kangen machines. It'll break them. So those usually often are putting chloride into, and so that's another very bad problem. So a lot of the like consumer drinking water solutions are very problematic, which for your body is good. Your body likes sodium. So in the case of adding sodium and chloride, like that's what an IV bag is. So if you go to the hospital and you're having a bad time, they give you sodium chloride. So in the case of humans and drinking water, that can be very good. In the case of plants, it's very problematic. Now, sometimes there are now if you're talking about something that filters out minerals, usually those are some sort of exchange bed, which again are fine for drinking water, but very problematic for living soil because of what is being exchanged. Usually is problematic for soil. Usually it's chloride. So now, as far as remineralizing water after using RO, if you're using in living soil like an irrigation blue mat system, it performs the worst on RO water. It seems to mess up the water tension and how the system operates. It's also very problematic if you fill the carrot itself with RO. And in that case, just a few parts per million of something works very well. If you are in a situation where you need to do reverse osmosis treatment, I do advise that you mineralize in some fashion. Again, in that case, the fertinitrofulvic powder is the most economical. And all you need to do is sprinkle a little bit in there until you get like 50 to 100 parts per million of what's in there. And those fulvic acid products that are fermented from grain actually have a decent amount of just mineral in them and trace mineral, and they can be very beneficial. So now if you were to use the Organics Alive product and you put that into to reverse osmosis water, because that water is so empty, it's likely going to radically lower the pH prior to getting enough parts per million, so to speak, if that makes sense. So as far as just like remineralizing RO, I would my preferred choice is the Fertinitro-Fulvic. It's very economical. You use a very low application rate to get 50, 70 parts per million. Now it looks like there's a clarification there. He's talking about filtering out minerals. So I haven't found those types of equipment to be super effective for our needs because again, it's going to be an exchange bed. So normally, you're talking about like some sort of typically those products are for the restaurant industry so that the Coca-Cola doesn't taste like crap, and they're just trying to remove usually calcium, magnesium, or sodium, which can be done with different exchange bed filters, I believe they call them. And basically it's just filled with some sort of media that's charged up with a bunch of ions of something that exchange with the thing you're trying to remove. So, but yeah, whatever those chemicals are that exchange are very bad in living soil. So I haven't found, personally, maybe there's something out there that I'm not aware of, but I haven't found a lot of solutions that truly like remove things from the water without exchanging for something problematic for soils. The only filtration that I'm aware of that truly removes mineral content like that is obviously reverse osmosis, steam distillation, which I don't think anybody's going to put a steam distiller at their farm, but reverse osmosis and steam distillation basically accomplish the same goals. Now, there is a company in Northern California called Watson Well. I haven't personally installed one of these in our client gardens, but I have heard pretty cool things about their ozone systems. And the nice things about those is they have significantly less wastewater. So it's kind of like zapping. It's probably a really crappy description of what their product does, but basically they're like, knocking the minerals out of the water through ozone treatment, and then the wastewater is significantly lower than that. Historically, they only built massive ones for big farms. You're talking like 200,000 gallon type systems. I have heard they have like residential skids now, but you're still talking about $10,000 to $20,000 type deal. So if you're a commercial farm, I think a good RO system could be $10,000 to $20,000 in most cases, and I've seen systems that are significantly more expensive than that. So when you start to get up to the few thousand gallon a day type water requirements, then something like a $15,000 water treatment skid starts to make sense. But for the case of the small home gardener, you're kind of stuck with the mineral content of your water and the RO. Now, statistically speaking, man, if I just have to throw like a random off the top of my head number, I'd say less than 10% of the farms we work with must use reverse osmosis as a treatment. I'd say the other 9 to 9.5 out of 10 farms that we work with, we can work with that water, and a lot of times it's very beneficial. So in a lot of situations where farmers would be just jumping right to reverse osmosis, there's actually pretty attractive mineral balance of that water, but you need to know what it is. So this morning, like I said, I built a custom fertilization blend for a home gardener today, and he had 107 parts per million of calcium in his water and almost no magnesium. That's a really rare situation there. And basically what we have to do is we have to increase the magnesium enough to correct that ratio between calcium and magnesium. Because if you don't, it doesn't matter how much fertilizer you dump into that water, it still comes down to basic principles of chemistry. And those ratios, those key ratios, calcium to magnesium, calcium to potassium, seem to be some of the more influential. They all matter, but those are the ones that truly will make a good or bad outcome, those need to be addressed, or else you're just going to keep fighting yourself. So, yeah. So I hope that helps. I hope I made some sense. I hope inspired some change, really, because we got to step it up here. I was having a conversation today with another commercial consultant friend, and it's pretty tight out there right now. We need to significantly increase our profitability per square foot. Most farmers are nowhere near the targets of what it takes to be financially viable in 2024. Most of the farms need to kind of double their productivity in order to get into those comfortably profitable ranges. If you're not starting with a basic water test, you're going to have a very difficult time doing that. And if you're not doing a fertilizer analysis somewhat regularly and repeatedly, you're going to find out after the fact that there are problems. And so maybe this is the most important takeaway right here, is the consequence to this is I do a tremendous amount of analysis of fertilization. I can order the same products from the same distributor for 5 different farms in the same day. And when those products arrive, if we start at the same starting point of a recipe, none of those are the same. One of my most favorite examples is 3 years ago, we used to use a trace mineral product. I'm not going to mention it because it doesn't really matter. But I signed up 3 or 4 clients in the same week, which is actually not that common. That was a pretty busy week as far as starting up client gardens. And they all ordered the same exact 5-pound jug of a trace mineral that contains iron, manganese, copper, and zinc. All those farmers in the next couple weeks started to build their recipes, and we check them by sending them to Wallace. One of them was missing iron in the recipe, one was missing copper in the recipe, and one of them was missing zinc in the recipe, and the other one was still not right. So if your fertilization is missing an essential nutrient, you're going to have plant health problems. If you don't know that, you're not going to know how to solve that problem, and then you're going to spend way more money on pest control products than you ever would solving the problem with a little bit of copper, right? And so most farmers don't understand that pretty much every product manufacturer ranges from doing an acceptable job to radically letting you down every time you buy products. Like, you need to know the levels of quality control of the products that you're using within reason. Now, I understand a lot of this audience is small home gardeners, and that becomes cost prohibitive. So one of the services we provide for those types of farmers is I do all the testing at the front end. So we buy large quantities of the minerals and the different fertilizer products, the different organics alive soluble powders, and I send them in for testing. And then based off of your water, I can build you custom fertilization where that checks and balance has been done. And so we do a lot of minor adjusting of the different products based on the batches we get in order to keep those ratios and targets in line. And so that's something that we're doing now. We started rolling it out, maybe 4 to 5 months ago. We've been doing that internally for clients for well over a year now. And that's something we've been slowly offering for small home gardeners and people that are just not going to pay hundreds of dollars of water testing and calibration of their fertilization. So that's something that we can do for you. I can put a link in the chat to where that is. And then, again, if you're interested in something like that, drop your comment in the chat and I'll circle back around. We can start to resolve those problems. So again, I want to thank you all for joining. And I hope you provided some value. You know the deal. Like, subscribe, notifications. You've heard it before. You're here on YouTube. But it does help the channel grow. Dropping a comment in the chat also helps the algorithm understand that you appreciated this content. And if you found some value, share it with your buddies. Or you can keep it a secret. I'm fine with that too. Secrets are good, especially when the times are getting tight. So anyways, thanks for joining in. We'll see you next week for part 2 in surviving regulated cannabis.